The landscape of South Yorkshire, specifically the communities encompassing Doncaster and Mexborough, carries the historical weight of industrial decline. In the absence of traditional industries that once anchored these towns, a distinct social vacuum emerged. For many young men growing up in these areas, this void was not filled by economic opportunity or structured ambition, but by the pervasive and dangerous allure of localized street gangs. These networks offer a counterfeit sense of belonging, an immediate identity, and a framework of distorted loyalty. They prey on the disenfranchised, converting restless teenagers into foot soldiers for territorial disputes that often border on the irrational. It is within this specific, volatile ecosystem that the lives of two young men, Lewis Williams and Taylor Meanley, became fatally intertwined. Lewis Williams was 20 years old, an age straddling the difficult boundary between adolescence and adulthood. To his family and those who knew him outside the context of street politics, he was a much-loved young man, someone who possessed a life and a personality completely separate from the grim realities of gang warfare. However, the gravitational pull of the local factions proved overwhelmingly strong. Williams became drawn into the dangerous undercurrents of Mexborough, establishing links with a notoriously prominent gang known as the Pittsmore Shotta Boys, commonly referred to by the acronym PSB. The Pittsmore Shotta Boys originally drew their name and core identity from the Pittsmore area of Sheffield, but their influence, alongside various splinter groups and associated factions, bled outward into neighboring districts like Doncaster and Mexborough. To be linked to the PSB was to inherit both their formidable street credibility and their extensive roster of enemies. For Lewis Williams, this association placed an invisible but highly dangerous target on his back. In an environment where postcode rivalries and gang affiliations dictated who was considered an ally and who was deemed a legitimate casualty, his connection to the PSB marked him as an adversary to rival networks operating in the same geographic space. On the opposite side of this localized divide stood Taylor Meanley. At just 17 years old, Meanley was a product of the very same post-industrial environment as Williams, yet he had surrendered entirely to its most violent and destructive elements. Legal officials and psychologists who later analyzed his background described a teenager living an utterly aimless existence. He was a young man drifting through his crucial formative years with little to no hope for a conventional future, lacking any ambition outside of a singular obsessive dedication to indulging in criminality. For Meanley, the gang lifestyle was not a temporary phase of rebellion, it was his sole vocation. Meanley meticulously crafted a fearsome public persona, adopting the street moniker T-Shots. He immersed himself deeply in the local drill rap subculture, a genre of music where aggressive, violent lyricism often serves as a direct, unfiltered mirror to actual street-level criminality. For Meanley, drill rap was far more than a creative outlet or a form of entertainment. It functioned as a hostile manifesto. It was a primary vehicle through which he could project menace, lay claim to local territory, and openly taunt anyone who dared to challenge his fragile, ego-driven sense of authority on the streets. To reinforce this terrifying alter ego, Meanley weaponized his social media presence. Platforms like Facebook and Instagram became digital extensions of the gang turf war. He actively utilized these networks to cultivate and maintain a reputation built purely on intimidation. In the months leading up to the inevitable climax of his rivalry with the PSB, Meanley uploaded explicit, threatening photographs to his public accounts. These images were carefully curated to instill fear, featuring tactical gloves, a dark balaclava, live shotgun cartridges, and a crude but highly lethal firearm. The weapon featured in Meanley's digital posturing was a slam gun. He had acquired this device in November 2020 at the age of just 16. A slam gun is a homemade improvised firearm, typically constructed from two interlocking pieces of metal pipe and a fixed firing pin. Because it is assembled from basic hardware components, it bypasses all legal licensing, requires no background checks, and possesses no traceable serial number. It is an inherently unstable and wildly inaccurate weapon, designed for one singular, brutal purpose, inflicting catastrophic trauma at extremely close range. The fact that a teenager sought out and possessed such a weapon highlighted a profound level of premeditation and an absolute immersion in a deadly subculture. Meanley's descent into armed criminality was not hindered by positive intervention. The support system surrounding him appeared to normalize, if not passively encourage, his antisocial trajectory. Following his eventual incarceration, his father publicly commented on a photograph of Meanley taken inside prison, expressing overt pride in his son and urging him to stay strong against his detractors. This familial validation provides a crucial window into Meanley's worldview, revealing an environment where extreme violence and defiance of the law were not condemned as failures, but were instead validated as badges of honor. Meanley and his older associate, 21-year-old Jack Parks, belonged to a localized rival faction operating in direct opposition to the Pittsmore Shotta Boys. The architecture of this gang war was not constructed around highly lucrative drug supply lines or sophisticated organized crime syndicate disputes. Instead, it was driven by sheer geographic proximity, highly bruised adolescent egos, and a deeply toxic interpretation of respect. It was a turf war fought over invisible borders by young men who had very little else to lose. The catalyst that ignited this lethal feud was almost absurdly trivial. The spark that initiated the chain of deadly events between Meanley's faction and the PSB was the alleged theft of a bicycle. In a rational society, such an event is a minor property dispute. However, within the hyper-masculine, deeply paranoid ecosystem of South Yorkshire's street gangs, the theft was perceived as an unforgivable act of blatant disrespect. It was a slight that demanded immediate, physical and highly disproportionate retaliation, setting off a catastrophic chain reaction. This dispute rapidly mutated from verbal threats and minor street skirmishes into a dangerous, life-threatening campaign of tit-for-tat violence. As the animosity escalated, members or associates linked to the Pittsmore Shotta Boys decided to send a definitive, terrifying message to Meanley's faction. They chose to bypass the teenagers entirely and targeted their families, crossing a widely understood but fragile boundary in gang warfare. The violence was no longer confined to the youth. It was brought directly to the doorsteps of their relatives. The escalation reached a fever pitch when the violence arrived directly at Taylor Meanley's home. In a calculated act of terror, his mother's vehicle was intentionally set on fire, transforming a quiet residential street into a chaotic scene of arson. More terrifyingly, individuals approached the property and discharged a shotgun directly through the front door of her house. This was a deliberate, highly orchestrated attack designed to humiliate Meanley, expose his inability to protect his own family, and demonstrate the absolute ruthlessness and reach of his rivals. For a teenager whose entire identity, self-worth, and public image were predicated on projecting an aura of strength, fearlessness, and dominance, the attack on his mother's home was psychologically devastating. It was a profound public humiliation that completely shattered his carefully cultivated image of invulnerability. Meanley already possessed a deeply ingrained, documented habit of responding violently to any perceived wrong. Following the attack on his mother, the conflict transformed. This was no longer just about gang affiliation or postcode posturing. It had become a deeply personal, obsessive vendetta that required a lethal response. The point of no return had been crossed. The slam gun, acquired months prior as a tool for digital intimidation, was now primed for active execution. The lines of the feud were irreversibly drawn in the streets of Mexborough. Lewis Williams, simply through his established links to the Pittsmoor Shotta Boys, was marked as a legitimate target in the eyes of his rivals. The stage was set for an inevitable, catastrophic collision between a 20-year-old young man caught up in the fatal allure of gang associations and a 17-year-old boy armed with an improvised shotgun, an aimless future, and an unquenchable thirst for violent retribution. The transition from idle threat to calculated hunt began within the confined space of a light blue Jaguar, a vehicle that would soon serve as the operational base for an impending execution. Taylor Meanley was no longer operating as an isolated individual reacting to a grievance. The attack on his mother's property had catalyzed a severe shift in his operational tactics, prompting him to draw upon the resources and manpower of his criminal associates. He mobilized a crew that transformed a personal vendetta into a coordinated, gang-sanctioned operation. The Jaguar was driven by Jack Parks, a willing facilitator whose control of the vehicle dictated the pace and direction of the escalation. Parks was not merely a chauffeur, he was an integral component of the lethal machinery being assembled. By providing the transportation, Parks offered Meanley the mobility required to track down rivals across the winding residential streets of Mexborough. The tight geography of the area meant that gang factions were often operating in close proximity, making a fast, maneuverable vehicle an essential tool for both intimidation and sudden, violent strikes. Joining Meanley and Parks in the Jaguar were Joe Anderton and Arlind Nika, two associates whose presence elevated the severity of the situation from a solitary act of revenge to a collective mission. The inclusion of Anderton and Nika provided a crucial psychological buffer for Meanley. In the context of gang dynamics, the presence of peers validates violent intent, effectively neutralizing any lingering individual hesitation. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was characterized by a dangerous synergy, fueled by a shared commitment to the retaliatory strike. This was the dark reality of the Pittsmoor Shotta Boys' influence bleeding into the local street conflicts. The gang's reputation was built on a foundation of uncompromising territorial dominance and a swift, disproportionate response to any disrespect. For Meanley and his crew, failing to respond lethally to the targeting of a family member's home would have been perceived as a catastrophic display of weakness within their illicit hierarchy. The weapon Meanley held was a crude but devastatingly effective piece of improvised engineering known as a slam gun. Unlike a manufactured firearm, which relies on complex internal mechanisms, springs, and safety catches, a slam gun is an exercise in brutal simplicity. It typically consists of two interlocking lengths of steel piping. The rear section is sealed at one end and fitted with a fixed firing pin, often a heavy nail or a sharpened screw, welded directly into the base. The front section serves as the barrel into which a standard 12-gauge shotgun cartridge is loaded. To discharge the weapon, the user must physically slide the barrel section forcefully backward into the rear section, slamming the primer of the shotgun shell directly against the fixed pin. Preparing and operating such a weapon requires deliberate, aggressive physical force. It is entirely devoid of precision, safety features, or accidental triggers. The very act of loading a shotgun cartridge into the steel pipe demonstrated Meanley's explicit, premeditated intent to inflict catastrophic biological damage. Inside the Jaguar, this improvised firearm was no longer a prop for digital posturing. It was resting in the hands of a 17-year-old actively seeking a target. The escalation of tensions in the days and hours leading up to January 11, 2021, was methodical. The crew did not simply stumble into a confrontation, they actively hunted for it. The light blue Jaguar became a recognizable symbol of the impending violence prowling the streets of Mexborough with a predatory focus. The local infrastructure, characterized by dense housing estates, narrow interconnecting roads, and pedestrian alleyways, served as the hunting ground. The rival faction, which included 20-year-old Lewis Williams, was known to frequent these specific areas. For Meanley and his associates, the objective was to intercept Williams or his associates within this shared geographic space. The patrols conducted by Parks were not random drives. They were targeted surveillance operations designed to establish the movement patterns of their adversaries. This systematic searching heightened the anxiety not only among the rival gang members, but across the wider community, where the rumblings of an inevitable clash were becoming increasingly apparent to local residents. Complicating the physical hunt was the digital ecosystem that fueled the animosity between the two factions. The physical patrols were mirrored by a continuous stream of provocation across social media platforms and encrypted messaging applications. In modern gang conflicts, digital taunting acts as an accelerant, accelerating the timeline from verbal disputes to physical violence. Threats issued online require real-world validation to maintain credibility within the gang culture. For Meanley, the digital disrespect shown by his rivals regarding the attack on his mother's property demanded a physical response that would permanently silence the opposition. The presence of mobile phones in the Jaguar was therefore twofold. They were tools for coordinating the hunt through network communication, and they were instruments for documenting the anticipated victory. Joe Anderton's readiness to operate a mobile phone camera during the patrol underscored the performative nature of the escalation. The crew intended not only to execute a rival, but to record the aftermath, a generating digital currency that would elevate their status within the Pittsmore Shotta Boys and the broader drill music subculture that glorified such acts. As the morning of January 11th gave way to the afternoon, the operational tempo inside the Jaguar reached a critical threshold. The vehicle continued its sweeping routes through Mexborough, utilizing the mobility provided by Parks to cover extensive ground while remaining highly visible to anyone aligned with the rival faction. The psychological state of the four occupants was locked onto the necessity of a confrontation. The adrenaline associated with carrying a loaded, improvised firearm through hostile territory created a volatile environment within the car. Every pedestrian observed, every vehicle passed. I was subjected to immediate scrutiny to determine if they were aligned with Lewis Williams. The environment inside the Jaguar was a pressure cooker of teenage bravado, deeply ingrained gang loyalty, and an overriding obsession with retaliatory justice. The collective decision-making process had been entirely stripped of rational consequence, replaced by the tunnel vision of gang warfare, where the only acceptable outcome is the physical destruction of the enemy. The tracking of Lewis Williams was facilitated by a network of local intelligence and the predictable nature of neighborhood movements. The Jaguar navigated the streets with the specific intent of cutting off escape routes, utilizing the layout of Mexborough to their tactical advantage. The coordination between Parks at the wheel and Meanley armed in the passenger seat required a synchronicity built on shared lethal intent. Parks had to maintain the vehicle's position and speed to allow Meanley an unobstructed line of sight and the physical leverage necessary to operate the slam gun. The crude mechanics of the weapon dictated that the attack had to occur at extremely close range to be effective, necessitating a drive-by approach that would bring the Jaguar within feet of the target. This logistical requirement forced the vehicle deeper into the specific areas where Williams was known to be operating, increasing the likelihood of an imminent encounter. By late afternoon, the localized surveillance began to yield the desired results. The movements of the Jaguar became tighter, while focusing on specific corridors where intelligence or sightings indicated the presence of the rival group. The digital communications among the crew likely fell silent as visual tracking took precedence over network chatter. The anticipation of the strike demanded complete focus. Meanly, holding the assembled sections of the slam gun, prepared for the physical exertion required to detonate the 12-gauge cartridge. Anderton, positioned with his mobile device, prepared to document the culmination of their escalating vendetta. Nika's presence solidified the numerical and psychological superiority of the attacking force. Parks adjusted the trajectory of the Jaguar, transitioning from a broad patrol pattern into a direct interception vector. The streets of Mexborough, previously just a backdrop for territorial disputes and digital posturing, were now the finalized stage for an execution. The abstract concept of gang retaliation had fully materialized into a loaded weapon, a speeding car, and a localized hunt that was rapidly closing the distance between Taylor Meanley and Lewis Williams. The light blue Jaguar prowled the residential streets of Mexborough under the fading light of a cold January afternoon. Jack Parks gripped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the pavements while maneuvering the heavy vehicle with deliberate intent. The hunting phase was nearing its conclusion. Visual confirmation had been established. Lewis Williams was walking along Wath Road, isolated and entirely unaware of the lethal force closing in on his position. Inside the cabin of the Jaguar, the atmosphere shifted from tense anticipation to cold execution. The digital silence among the crew reflected the gravity of the impending strike. Every occupant understood their role in the choreographed violence about to unfold on the public thoroughfare. Taylor Meanley sat in the passenger seat, the crude weight of the assembled slam gun resting in his hands. The weapon was a testament to improvised lethality. Constructed from two interlocking pieces of metal pipe, it lacked a traditional trigger mechanism, safety catch, or refined targeting sights. It was designed for one purpose, functioning through brute force at close range. A standard 12-gauge shotgun cartridge sat chambered within the front section of the pipe. The rear section, capped with a fixed metal firing pin, acted as the firing mechanism. To discharge the weapon, the user had to forcefully slide the rear pipe forward, violently slamming the firing pin into the primer of the cartridge. It required physical exertion, a deliberate and aggressive bodily movement that made accidental discharge unlikely, but purposeful execution devastating. Meanley adjusted his grip on the cold steel, anticipating the recoil and the sheer kinetic energy that the homemade firearm would soon unleash. In the rear of the vehicle, Joe Anderton raised his mobile phone. The screen illuminated his face as he activated the camera application, ensuring the lens had a clear line of sight through the passenger window. The decision to document the attack transformed the impending murder into a digital trophy. It demonstrated a profound clinical detachment from the reality of taking a human life. Arlen Nika maintained his position within the vehicle, providing the numerical superiority and psychological reinforcement that emboldened the crew. The four young men operated as a cohesive unit, driven by the escalating vendetta that had culminated in this final, violent intercept. Parks applied pressure to the accelerator, narrowing the distance between the Jaguar and the pedestrian. He matched the speed of the vehicle to the walking pace of Lewis Williams, calculating the optimal angle for the strike. The engine noise was momentarily masked by the ambient sounds of the Mexborough traffic. Parks steered the Jaguar closer to the curb, aligning the passenger side directly with the target. The spatial dynamics of the street offered Lewis no immediate avenue of escape. He was boxed in by the brick walls of the residential properties on one side and the approaching vehicle on the other. As the Jaguar drew level with Lewis Williams, the passenger window was fully lowered. The freezing January air rushed into the cabin, mixing with the sudden surge of adrenaline. Lewis turned his head toward the vehicle, registering the immediate threat in the fraction of a second before the strike. There was no time for him to react, run, or seek cover. The physical proximity between the weapon and the target was minimal, ensuring maximum destructive transfer. meanly thrust the barrel of the slam gun out of the open window. He braced his body against the passenger seat, his muscles tensing as he gripped the rear section of the pipe. With a rapid, forceful motion, he pulled the rear pipe back and slammed it violently forward against the front section. The fixed firing pin struck the brass primer of the 12-gauge cartridge. Inside the confined chamber of the steel pipe, the primer ignited the chemical propellant. The rapidly expanding gases created immense pressure, forcing the payload of lead shot out of the improvised barrel at supersonic speed. The discharge was a deafening, percussive crack that shattered the routine calm of Wath Road. A flash of muzzle fire illuminated the fading afternoon light, followed instantly by a plume of thick, acrid smoke that billowed back into the cabin of the Jaguar and out onto the street. The physics of the close-range blast were unforgiving. The cluster of lead pellets, still tightly grouped together due to the proximity of the shot, I struck Lewis Williams with catastrophic force. The primary impact zones were his neck and chest. The kinetic energy of the shotgun blast tore through his heavy winter clothing and penetrated deeply into his upper body. The physiological devastation was instantaneous. The lead pellets severed vital blood vessels, pulverized tissue, and caused massive structural damage to his respiratory and vascular systems. The sheer trauma of the impact arrested his forward momentum, sending a shock wave through his central nervous system. Hemorrhagic shock began immediately as his circulatory system was catastrophically breached. Lewis Williams collapsed onto the cold pavement of Wath Road. The biological reality of the wound meant that his blood volume depleted at a fatal rate. He was rendered immediately incapacitated, lying severely injured as the echoes of the gunshot rolled across the residential neighborhood. Inside the Jaguar, the recoil of the slam gun threw meanly back against his seat. The sulphurous smell of burnt gunpowder filled the tight space. Anderton lowered his mobile phone, the digital recording of the murder successfully captured and stored in the device's memory. The primary objective had been achieved with brutal efficiency. Parks did not hesitate. He floored the accelerator, the tires gripping the tarmac as the heavy Jaguar surged forward. The vehicle sped away from the scene, navigating the outward routes of Mexborough to distance the crew from the epicenter of the violence they had just orchestrated. Back on Wath Road, the sudden explosion of violence left the immediate bystanders in a state of profound shock. For a brief moment, the street was frozen in disbelief. Then, the reality of the bleeding young man on the pavement broke the paralysis. Chaos erupted. Pedestrians who had been going about their daily routines suddenly found themselves thrust into the center of a horrific trauma scene. Screams pierced the cold air as witnesses realized the severity of what had just occurred. Multiple frantic calls were made to the 999 Emergency Dispatch Center. Callers described the loud bang, the fleeing vehicle, and the catastrophic injuries sustained by the victim. While the emergency operators dispatched armed response vehicles and ambulances to the location, courageous members of the public rushed to Lewis Williams's side. Strangers knelt on the freezing concrete, entirely unprepared for the sheer volume of blood loss. They attempted to administer rudimentary first aid, using whatever materials they had on hand to apply pressure to the gaping wounds in his neck and chest. Their efforts were desperate and frantic, a human response attempting to stem an irreversible biological failure. The distant wail of sirens quickly grew louder, signaling the rapid approach of the emergency services. A fleet of police vehicles and specialized ambulance units descended upon Wath Road. The first arriving police officers immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. They drew their weapons, securing the immediate area in case the shooters returned, while simultaneously clearing a path for the paramedics to reach the victim. Specially trained trauma paramedics leapt from their rapid response vehicles, carrying heavy medical trauma bags directly to where Lewis Williams lay. They swiftly took over from the exhausted bystanders. A rapid clinical assessment confirmed the grim reality of the situation. The patient was unresponsive, his airway severely compromised by the trauma to his neck. The chest wound indicated massive internal hemorrhage that could not be controlled by external pressure alone. The paramedics initiated advanced life support protocols right there on the pavement of Wath Road. They worked with clinical precision amidst the chaotic environment. Oxygen was administered via a bag valve mask in a desperate attempt to oxygenate his failing system. Paramedics cut away his blood-soaked clothing to fully expose the chest cavity, searching for an entry wound to apply specialized chest seals designed to prevent lung collapse. Intravenous lines were urgently sought to push emergency fluids and medications into his collapsing circulatory system. However, the sheer extent of the vascular destruction caused by the close-range shotgun blast proved insurmountable. The human body requires a closed, pressurized circulatory system to deliver oxygen to the brain and vital organs. The damage inflicted by the slam gun had permanently destroyed that system. Despite the aggressive and continuous medical interventions, Lewis Williams's vital signs continued to plummet. He went into full cardiac arrest on the street. The paramedics immediately commenced cardiopulmonary resuscitation, performing chest compressions in a physically exhausting effort to manually pump whatever blood remained through his heart. Defibrillator pads were applied to his chest, analyzing the underlying electrical rhythm of his failing heart, hoping for a shockable rhythm that could restore a pulse. The medical team cycled through their advanced resuscitation algorithms, pushing doses of adrenaline and continuing compressions. The fight for his life was intense but ultimately futile. The catastrophic blood loss and resulting oxygen deprivation had caused irreversible systemic failure. After prolonged and exhaustive resuscitative efforts, the clinical parameters offered no hope of recovery. The paramedics ceased their interventions. The algorithms of emergency trauma medicine had been entirely exhausted. At exactly 5 o'clock in the evening, surrounded by medical debris and the flashing blue lights of emergency vehicles, Lewis Williams was pronounced dead at the scene. The immediate transition from a medical emergency to a full-scale homicide investigation began the moment the pronouncement was made. Wath Road ceased to be a public thoroughfare and was officially designated a major crime scene. South Yorkshire police officers extended the physical perimeters, rolling out yards of blue and white police tape to establish an inner and outer cordon. They pushed the gathering crowds of shocked onlookers far back from the epicenter of the violence. The integrity of the physical evidence had to be preserved at all costs. A sterile forensic tent was erected over the body of Lewis Williams, shielding the deceased from public view and protecting the immediate forensic trace evidence from the harsh winter elements. Scene of crime officers, dressed in full white protective suits, masks, and gloves, stepped inside the taped perimeter. They began the slow, methodical process of documenting the aftermath of the drive-by shooting. Bright floodlights were brought in to illuminate the darkening street. The forensic team searched meticulously for any physical remnants of the attack, scanning the tarmac for shotgun wadding, discarded medical equipment, tire tracks left by the accelerating Jaguar, and the exact spatial distribution of the blood evidence. The meticulous collection of data would form the foundation of the investigation, locking down the physical reality of the execution that had abruptly ended a 20-year-old life on the streets of Mexborough. Oh, illuminate the macabre tableau on Wath Road, casting stark, elongated shadows across the pavement. Within this cordoned perimeter, ballistics experts meticulously placed yellow evidence markers next to scattered metallic fragments. These were not the standard casings expelled by a conventional firearm, but rather the dispersed lead pellets of a discharged 12-gauge shotgun cartridge. The erratic spread pattern indicated a close-range blast from a weapon lacking a proper choked barrel. Nearby, a pathologist conducted a preliminary examination of Lewis Williams. The visual assessment confirmed the devastating reality of the attack. More than 100 individual pellets had struck the 20-year-old victim at close quarters, inflicting catastrophic, unsurvivable trauma to his face, neck, and chest. Once the scene documentation was complete, the victim was carefully placed into a body bag and transported to the local mortuary for a formal post-mortem examination, while the focus of the South Yorkshire Police shifted entirely to hunting down his killers. A major incident room was immediately established. Detectives flooded the streets of Mexborough, knocking on doors and taking statements from visibly shaken residents and bystanders. The sudden execution outside a farm food store in broad daylight had left the community paralyzed with fear. Eyewitnesses provided the first crucial pieces of the investigative puzzle. Several people reported hearing a loud, concussive boom that many initially mistook for a rogue firework. When they turned toward the noise, they saw a light blue Jaguar accelerating away from the scene. Witnesses noted that the car had a missing front badge and appeared to have been lying in wait, having driven past the victim once before executing a deliberate U-turn to make a second fatal pass. The description of the getaway vehicle was immediately broadcast across all police radio channels. Automatic number plate recognition cameras were checked, and traffic units began scouring the surrounding districts. The breakthrough came faster than anticipated, though not in the manner investigators had hoped. Less than an hour after the shooting, emergency dispatch received a call reporting a vehicle engulfed in flames near Ingsfield Lane in the nearby village of Bolton upon Dearne. Fire crews and police units rushed to the secluded dirt track. They found a light blue Jaguar matching the exact description of the suspect vehicle. On the Inferno was a calculated attempt to obliterate forensic trace evidence. Flames licked through the shattered windows, consuming the upholstery, the steering wheel, and the dashboard. Firefighters swiftly extinguished the blaze, leaving behind a charred, smoldering shell. Crime scene investigators approached the ruined vehicle with tempered expectations. Fire is highly destructive to organic material, often vaporizing blood, hair, and fingerprints. However, as forensics teams sifted through the blackened debris inside the cabin, they made a monumental discovery. Resting in the ash of the ruined passenger compartment were the distinct, heavy metallic components of an improvised firearm. Ballistics experts examined the recovered object and identified it as a rudimentary slam gun. It consisted of two heavy-duty metal pipes, welded together, incorporating a crude internal firing pin mechanism. It featured no conventional trigger, no safety catch, and no ergonomic grip. The weapon was designed to be operated manually by forcefully sliding the rear section forward, slamming the firing pin into the primer of a standard 12-gauge shotgun shell. Despite the intense heat of the vehicle fire, the heavy steel pipes had survived. Subsequent laboratory analysis of the scorched metal recovered trace DNA. Furthermore, ballistics experts were able to definitively match the dimensions and internal scoring of the slam gun pipes to the specific type of damage inflicted on the wad and pellets recovered from the pavement on Wath Road. Simultaneously, detectives were aggressively pursuing the digital trail left by the Jaguar. By tracking the vehicle's movements backward through Mexborough's network of private and municipal closed-circuit television cameras, police discovered that the car was operating on false license plates. Cross-referencing the make, model, and distinct lack of a front badge with regional theft reports, they identified the Jaguar as having been stolen in Sheffield several days prior to the murder. The CCTV trawl proved to be the most devastating tool in the police arsenal. Investigators tracked the stolen Jaguar's journey throughout January the 11th. The footage revealed an escalating pattern of antisocial behavior and violence in the hours preceding the murder, including an incident where bricks were hurled at a property. The most critical footage was retrieved from a BP service station in Goldthorpe, recorded shortly before the fatal confrontation. The high-definition cameras at the petrol station captured the Jaguar pulling onto the forecourt. 5 young men were visible. They were seen purchasing items, interacting with one another, and confirming their collective presence in the vehicle. Facial recognition and local intelligence quickly identified the individuals. Among them were 17-year-old Taylor Meanley, Jack Parks, Arlen Nika, and Joe Anderton. The hierarchy and roles within the vehicle began to solidify as police matched the faces to known associates embroiled in a bitter, ongoing feud with the Pittsmore Shotta Boys, a gang linked to the victim. With the identities of the suspects confirmed, South Yorkshire Police orchestrated a series of coordinated, simultaneous dawn raids. Armed response units breached addresses across Mexborough and the surrounding areas. Taylor Meanley, Jack Parks, and Joe Anderton were apprehended in their beds, deeply asleep, and entirely unprepared for the overwhelming police presence. Arlen Nika, who had fled the region in an attempt to evade capture, was tracked down and arrested in London. All 4 suspects were taken into custody, cautioned, and transported to secure holding facilities for interrogation. During the initial police interviews, the suspects adopted a unified stance of denial. Taylor Meanley sat across from detectives, his posture relaxed, and flatly denied any involvement in the shooting. He claimed he had no access to firearms, had not been in the Jaguar at the time of the murder, and knew nothing about the death of Lewis Williams. Jack Parks and the others offered similar obfuscations, relying on a collective amnesia regarding the events on Wath Road. However, the police did not need confessions. The digital evidence seized during the raids provided an airtight, irrefutable narrative of premeditated murder. When investigators downloaded the contents of Joe Anderton's confiscated mobile phone, they uncovered a piece of evidence so damning it negated any defense the suspects could mount. Saved in the device's memory was a video recording of the murder itself. The footage, shot from the back seat of the Jaguar, provided a terrifying first-person perspective of the drive-by shooting. It captured the interior of the car as Jack Parks drove down Wath Road. It showed Taylor Meanley sitting in the front passenger seat, clutching the metal slam gun. The audio recorded the tense atmosphere inside the cabin, culminating in Parks applying the brakes to give Meanley the optimum shooting angle. Voices could be heard shouting instructions, explicitly urging Meanley to shoot. The video then documented Meanley leaning out of the open passenger window and discharging the slam gun directly at Lewis Williams. Investigators later determined that Meanley had specifically instructed Anderton to film the attack, intending to use the footage as a macabre trophy to boast of his actions and elevate his status within the local gang hierarchy. The digital forensic investigation into Taylor Meanley's electronic footprint yielded further proof of his premeditation. Cybercrime analysts executing search warrants on his social media accounts uncovered a series of boastful, intimidating posts published in the days immediately leading up to the murder. On his Facebook profile, Meanley had uploaded a photograph showcasing the exact homemade slam gun recovered from the burnt-out Jaguar. Deliberately arranged next to the lethal contraption were a pair of dark gloves, a black balaclava, and a live 12-gauge shotgun cartridge. The caption accompanying the image featured threats and bragging about firearms, signaling his clear intent to escalate the ongoing gang rivalry to lethal violence. To cement the connection, crime scene investigators executing the search warrant at Meanley's home address discovered a spent 12-gauge shotgun cartridge hidden in the property. Ballistics experts analyzed the casing and confirmed it was identical in make and manufacture to the live cartridge Meanley had photographed for social media. The amalgamation of evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution possessed the murder weapon, the recovered getaway vehicle, traced DNA, ANPR tracking, CCTV footage of the suspects gathering before the attack, CCTV footage of the car executing the drive-by, social media posts of the killer posing with the weapon, and a high-definition video of the murder being committed, recorded by the killers themselves. Faced with this insurmountable mountain of proof, the Crown Prosecution Service authorized immediate charges. Taylor Meanley, Jack Parks, Joe Anderton, and Arland Nika were formally charged with murder and possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. The rapid, meticulous investigation by the Major Crime Unit had dismantled the gang's crude attempts at concealing their tracks. The decision to set the Jaguar alight had failed to destroy the heavy steel of the slam gun, and their own arrogance in filming the crime had provided the police with the ultimate witness. The investigation was formally concluded, and the preparation for a grueling trial at Sheffield Crown Court began, setting the stage for the judicial reckoning of a senseless, ego-driven execution. Lou's compilation of this evidence by South Yorkshire Police laid the groundwork for a formidable prosecution case. Detectives possessed the visual recording of the murder, but a video alone, regardless of its clarity, requires corroborating scientific data to secure a conviction and dismantle anticipated defense strategies. The investigation pivoted toward the microscopic and the digital, initiating an exhaustive examination of the physical traces left by the weapon and the invisible electronic web spun by the perpetrator's mobile devices. The synthesis of this data would ultimately transform the fragmented chaos of a drive by shooting into a synchronized, undeniable timeline of premeditated murder. The primary focus of the physical forensic investigation centered on the murder weapon, identified as a homemade slam gun. Firearms experts at the National Laboratory conducted a comprehensive analysis of the weapon's mechanics and the ballistic evidence recovered from the crime scene and the victim. Unlike factory-manufactured shotguns, slam guns are crude, improvised firearms constructed from basic hardware components, typically two interlocking metal pipes. They lack a traditional trigger mechanism, a sealed firing breech, or a rifled barrel. Instead, they operate through raw kinetic force. A standard shotgun cartridge is inserted into the outer pipe, and the inner pipe, fitted with a fixed metal pin acting as a firing pin, is slammed forcefully forward. The impact detonates the primer, firing the shell. This primitive design is highly volatile and inherently inaccurate at long distances, but it is devastatingly lethal at close range. Forensic pathologists recovered multiple lead pellets from the neck and chest cavity of Lewis Williams during the post-mortem examination. Ballistic specialists analyzed these projectiles under microscopic conditions, matching their size, weight, and metallic composition to standard 12-gauge shotgun ammunition. Because the barrel of the slam gun was a smooth, unmachined piece of industrial steel pipe, it imparted no distinct rifling marks on the shot wad. However, the violently sudden and unrefined discharge mechanism left unique, identifiable striae and tool marks on the brass base of the spent cartridge casing. These microscopic abrasions provided a unique mechanical signature, linking the fired shell directly to the specific improvised firing pin utilized in the attack. Furthermore, the crude construction of the slam gun produced significant secondary forensic evidence. The lack of a sealed firing chamber meant that upon detonation, the expanding gases were not contained solely behind the projectile. Instead, a pressurized cloud of gunshot residue blew backward out of the breech mechanism and into the passenger compartment of the Jaguar. When crime scene investigators located and seized the vehicle driven by Jack Parks, it was subjected to intense forensic scrutiny. Technicians systematically swabbed the interior surfaces, focusing on the seating arrangements and door panels. The recovered swabs were transported to the forensic laboratory and analyzed using scanning electron microscopy combined with energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy. This highly advanced technique bombards the sample with an electron beam, causing the elements within the sample to emit X-rays that identify their exact atomic composition. The analysis yielded definitive results. High concentrations of characteristic gunshot residue, specifically microscopic, spherical particles containing fused lead, barium, and antimony were detected on the rear passenger side door panel, the seatbelt webbing, and the ceiling fabric directly above the seating position occupied by Taylor Meanley. This chemical footprint perfectly aligned with the trajectory, blast radius, and physical dynamics of firing a slam gun from a moving vehicle. The forensic data scientifically eliminated any possibility that the fatal shot was fired from outside the car or by the driver, cementing Meanley's role as the trigger man. Blood spatter analysis further corroborated the positioning of the vehicle at the moment of the murder. Microscopic aerosolized droplets of the victim's blood were identified on the exterior paintwork of the Jaguar's rear door. We swept backward by the aerodynamic flow of the accelerating vehicle at the exact fraction of a second the shot impacted the victim. While the physical sciences anchored the weapon to the vehicle and the shooter, digital forensics mapped the premeditation, coordination, and geographical movements of the killers. Detectives impounded the mobile phones belonging to Meanley, Parks, Anderton, and Nika. The digital extraction process utilized advanced law enforcement forensic software capable of bypassing security encryption and creating a complete physical image of each device's internal memory. Digital analysts recovered gigabytes of data, filtering through thousands of files to isolate deleted text messages, hidden media, and background location logs. The raw video file of the murder recorded by Joe Anderton was subjected to deep metadata analysis. Beyond the visual evidence of the shooting, the file contained embedded, exchangeable image file format data. This hidden layer of digital information recorded the precise parameters of the device at the moment the record button was pressed. The metadata extracted from the video file provided exact time and date stamps down to the millisecond, along with the precise global positioning system coordinates of the phone. This digital signature placed the recording device at the exact geographical coordinates of Wath Road in Mexborough, at the precise moment emergency services were receiving frantic calls from bystanders attempting to save the victim. To permanently dismantle any potential alibis, our telecommunications experts conducted an extensive cell site analysis of the 4 mobile devices. By tracking the continuous digital handshake between the suspects' mobile phones and local cellular network masts, analysts mapped their movements throughout the entire day of January 11th. Call data records were subpoenaed from the network providers. These records documented not only active phone calls and text messages, but also the background data connections initiated by social media applications running silently on the devices. Every time one of the phones connected to the network, it registered with the strongest local cell tower. Because these cellular masts utilized directional antennas covering specific geographical sectors, analysts could pinpoint not just which tower the phone connected to, but the specific azimuth or directional wedge the phone was located within. The data revealed a chilling pattern. The analysis showed the 4 individual devices converging at a central location earlier in the day before moving in total unison across South Yorkshire. The sequential network pinging precisely mirrored the route taken by the Jaguar. The continuous synchronized movement of the phones proved definitively that Meanley, Parks, Anderton, and Nika were traveling together, actively hunting their target. The integration of this cell site data with the regional automatic number plate recognition network created a timeline that was virtually impenetrable. Law enforcement ANPR cameras continuously scan and log the license plates of passing vehicles. Although the Jaguar was operating on cloned license plates in an attempt to evade detection, Analysts identified the vehicle's unique visual characteristics and tracked its movement through key intersections across the city. The timestamps generated by the ANPR camera captures perfectly matched the geographical progression registered by the suspect's mobile devices. Everywhere the cloned Jaguar was photographed by the traffic cameras, the 4 mobile phones registered with the adjacent cell towers at the exact same moment. The digital investigation also extended deep into the realm of social media, uncovering the raw intent behind the violence. Analysts recovered a sequence of Snapchat messages and videos uploaded in the hours preceding the murder. Taylor Meanley had actively utilized the platform to project aggression and boast about his gang affiliations and broadcast his violent intent. Because Snapchat servers retain temporary logs of user interactions and device memory often caches files scheduled for deletion, cybercrime detectives were able to retrieve digital communications that the suspects believed had permanently vanished. The forensic recovery of these erased communications revealed a clear, escalating timeline of hostility, directly linking the impending attack to the ongoing violent feud involving the Pittsmoor Shotta Boys. The digital footprint captured Meanley actively posing with the improvised slam gun prior to the drive-by. What the suspects intended as temporary posturing for rival gang members was transformed by forensic analysts into concrete, undeniable evidence of premeditated possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. The temporal proximity of these posts to the actual shooting demonstrated a calculated, cold-blooded readiness to commit murder. To further reinforce the geographical data, digital forensics experts examined the internal sensor logs of the mobile devices. Modern smartphones contain highly sensitive accelerometers and gyroscopes designed to track user movement. By extracting the raw diagnostic data from these sensors, analysts were able to determine the velocity at which the devices were traveling. The speed patterns extracted from the phones perfectly matched the acceleration and braking dynamics of a motor vehicle navigating residential streets, further disproving any potential claim that the suspects were traveling on foot or via public transport. Additionally, the device's background Wi-Fi probing features provided another layer of location verification. As the Jaguar drove through Mexborough, the suspects' phones continuously searched for available wireless networks, silently logging the unique media access control addresses of residential Wi-Fi routers they passed. By cross-referencing these logged addresses with a global database of known Wi-Fi networks, investigators plotted a secondary, highly localized route map that perfectly overlaid the primary cell site and ANPR data. This multi-layered approach to digital tracking ensured that every physical movement of the killers was backed by redundant, independent streams of electronic data. The culmination of this exhaustive investigative effort was the synthesis of these disparate strands of scientific and digital evidence into a single, cohesive narrative of the crime. Police analysts constructed a master timeline, a minute-by-minute data-driven presentation designed for the courtroom. On a single chronological axis, investigators plotted the ANPR hits of the cloned Jaguar, the sequential pings from the cell phone masts, the recovered timestamps of the deleted Snapchat uploads, the precise GPS metadata extracted from the murder video, and the conclusive physical ballistics evidence recovered from the vehicle and the victim. This comprehensive mapping left absolutely zero margin for error, defensive maneuvering, or alternative explanations. It tracked the suspects from their initial gathering, through the procurement of the lethal improvised weapon, along the calculated stalking route through the streets of Mexborough, directly to the fatal encounter on Wath Road, and finally mapped their chaotic, high-speed flight from the crime scene. The synchronized integration of digital forensics, cellular tracking, and advanced ballistic science proved conclusively that the occupants of the Jaguar were not random bystanders caught in a spontaneous act of violence, but a highly coordinated unit executing a targeted, premeditated assassination. The legal culmination of the investigation shifted the narrative from the streets of Mexborough to the formalized clinical environment of Sheffield Crown Court. For 6 arduous weeks, the courtroom became the arena where the fatal intersection of youth, gang culture, and improvised weaponry was forensically dissected. The trial required the jury to navigate complex legal doctrines, specifically the application of joint enterprise, and to determine the exact level of culpability for each of the 4 young men situated in the dock. The individuals facing judgment were 17-year-old Taylor Meanley, 21-year-old Jack Parks, 18-year-old Joe Anderton, and 16-year-old Arland Nika. Prosecutor Stephen Wood, QC, opened the case for the Crown, methodically outlining the anatomy of the shooting. The prosecution's objective was to establish undeniably that the killing of Lewis Williams was not a spontaneous tragedy or an intimidation tactic gone wrong, but rather a calculated, gang-related execution. Wood presented a narrative of escalating tit-for-tat violence between the defendant's associates and the Pittsmoor Shottaboys. To demonstrate premeditation and the psychological state of the primary shooter, the prosecution introduced digital evidence showcasing Meanley's desire to cultivate a fearsome criminal reputation. The jury was shown photographs Meanley had previously uploaded to social media, proudly posing with the lethal slam gun, a shotgun cartridge, gloves, and a balaclava. This imagery served as a cornerstone of the prosecution's argument, proving that Meanley possessed the weapon with clear intent and viewed it as a tool for status enhancement long before the fatal encounter. The demeanor of the defendants throughout the legal proceedings provided a chilling undercurrent to the trial. Any expectation of remorse or realization of the gravity of their situation was rapidly dismantled by their behavior. While being held on remand awaiting trial, Meanley demonstrated an absolute detachment from the fact that he had extinguished a human life. Bypassing prison security protocols, the 17-year-old accessed Facebook to upload a photograph of himself from behind bars. He accompanied the image with the flippant caption, "Just a little prison photo of me." The psychological void at the center of the crime was further illuminated by the public response to this upload. Among the supportive comments was a message from Meanley's own father, Mike Meanley, who wrote, "That's my boy and I am so proud of you. Stay strong, F them all." This staggering display of familial endorsement underscored the entrenched nature of the criminality the court was dealing with, presenting a portrait of a teenager completely insulated from moral accountability by his own support system. Within the courtroom, the defense teams faced a monumental task. They had to mitigate the overwhelming evidence of presence and participation by fracturing the prosecution's assertion of shared lethal intent. The legal battleground centered heavily on the principle of joint enterprise. Under United Kingdom law, secondary parties can be convicted of the principal offense if it can be proven they intentionally assisted or encouraged the crime with the knowledge that the principal actor intended to kill or cause grievous bodily harm. For Jack Parks, the defense faced the reality that he was the driver. The prosecution successfully argued that by maneuvering the vehicle into position and facilitating the drive-by, Parks was an equal partner in the murder, sharing the exact same lethal intent as the teenager who pulled the trigger. The defense for the passengers, Joe Anderton and Arland Nika, attempted to distance their clients from the ultimate act of murder. They argued against the notion that mere presence in the vehicle equated to an intent to kill. The jury was tasked with parsing out the microscopic differences in intent among the occupants of the car. They had to determine whether Anderton, who filmed the attack, and Nika, who accompanied them, were fully aware of Meanley's intention to inflict fatal harm, or if they believed the firearm was merely going to be used to frighten the rival gang. On October 15, 2021, after evaluating 6 weeks of complex legal arguments and testimony, the jury returned from their deliberations. The tension in Sheffield Crown Court materialized into profound silence as the foreman read the verdicts. The jury completely rejected the defense's attempts to minimize the roles of the two primary orchestrators. 17-year-old Taylor Meanley and 21-year-old Jack Parks were both found guilty of murder. The jury determined that the driver and the shooter operated with a unified, lethal purpose. For the two passengers, the jury reached a different legal conclusion regarding their internal intent. 18-year-old Joe Anderton and 16-year-old Arland Nika were acquitted of murder but were found guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. Additionally, all 4 defendants were uniformly convicted by the jury of possessing a firearm with intent to endanger life, cementing the collective danger they posed to the public. The sentencing hearing convened exactly 2 weeks later, on October 29, 2021. And the clinical detachment of the trial phase was replaced by the raw, devastating human cost of the crime. The court heard a harrowing victim impact statement from Lewis Williams's mother, Sandra. Her words stripped away the bravado of the gang rivalry, leaving only the permanent destruction of a family. She articulated that the loss of Lewis had left them entirely devastated and numb. She told the court that they were utterly broken without him, stating that life would never be the same. Her statement emphasized the unnatural cruelty of outliving a child, explaining that she felt lost, as if a vital piece of her own existence had been permanently severed, and that she did not know how she would ever be able to fix the resulting emotional crater. Following the victim impact statements, Judge Jeremy Richardson QC, the recorder of Sheffield, addressed the dock. His sentencing remarks delivered a scathing indictment, not only of the 4 defendants, but of the broader gang culture infecting the region. He categorized the killing as an exceptionally serious and dreadful affair, explicitly condemning the reality that a teenager could so easily acquire and deploy an improvised firearm on British streets. Addressing Meanley directly, Judge Richardson systematically dismantled the boy's inflated ego. He stated that Meanley had led an aimless life with little hope for the future, except indulging in crime. The judge noted that Meanley had possessed the weapon for some time, knew exactly what he was doing, and was, without question, a very dangerous individual. He made it clear that youth was the only factor preventing a harsher baseline, noting that had Meanley been an adult, the starting point for his sentence would have been 30 years. He further condemned the pernicious nature of wicked gangs that falsely appear attractive and provide a hollow sense of status to youths, expressing a grim hope that the sentences might deter future violence. The sentences handed down were severe, reflecting the uncompromising stance of the judiciary against gang-related firearm homicides. Taylor Meanley was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was ordered to serve a minimum term of 27 years behind bars before even being considered for parole. He received a concurrent sentence of 13 years for the firearms offense. Jack Parks was equally condemned, receiving an identical life sentence with a mandated minimum term of 27 years. The sentences for the manslaughter convictions reflected the secondary roles played by the passengers. Joe Anderton was sentenced to 12 years in a young offender institution. Arland Nika was similarly sentenced to 12 years of detention. The conclusion of the sentencing phase triggered one final legal maneuver regarding public transparency. Due to their ages, Taylor Meanley and Arland Nika had been protected by automatic reporting restrictions under Section 45 of the Youth Justice and Criminal Evidence Act, 1999. Throughout the trial, the media was legally barred from publishing their names or photographs. However, upon their conviction, journalists from rival regional newspapers united to submit a formal application to the court. They petitioned Judge Richardson to lift the anonymity orders. The media argued that the sheer severity of the crime, the public interest, and the necessity of deterring other youths from gang violence demanded that the killers be publicly identified. Judge Richardson agreed, ruling that the interests of justice demanded the general public know exactly who had committed this horrific crime. He stated it was vital for local citizens to know that the individuals who had menaced their community had been brought to justice. With the stroke of the judge's pen, the protective shield of youth anonymity was dissolved. The teenager who had sought fame through violence was permanently etched into the public record not as a glorified gangster, but as a convicted murderer facing almost 3 decades in a maximum security cell. With the gavel brought down and a minimum tariff of 27 years handed to Taylor Meanley, the expectation was that the steel doors of the British penal system would sever his connection to the outside world. The criminal justice system is designed to isolate, to punish, and to enforce a period of profound reflection. For a 17-year-old convicted of orchestrating a brutal drive-by shooting, a life sentence is intended to be the definitive end of his public narrative. The streets of Mexborough were supposed to be safe from his influence, and the family of Lewis Williams was supposed to be granted the quiet dignity of mourning without the perpetual interference of their son's killer. However, the modern infrastructure of incarceration is highly porous. The physical walls of the prison proved entirely inadequate against the invisible flow of digital data. Incarceration did not silence Meanley. It merely provided him with a new, highly authenticated platform to broadcast his remorselessness. Behind the concrete walls and iron bars, Meanley quickly bypassed the security measures of HM Prison Service. The underground economy of the UK prison system is flush with contraband, fueled by drones bypassing security netting, signal jammers, failing to block cellular networks, and sophisticated smuggling rings delivering illicit goods directly to cell windows. Meanley acquired a prohibited smartphone, a device that effectively dismantled his isolation. Rather than fading into obscurity, he resurrected his drill rap persona, operating under the moniker T-Shots. Drill music, a genre deeply rooted in the hyper-realistic documentation of gang violence, places a premium on authenticity. For an aspiring drill rapper, a murder conviction is often perversely viewed as the ultimate credential. Armed with a smuggled phone, Meanley transformed his prison cell into a makeshift recording studio. The resulting videos were characterized by their bleak, low-resolution aesthetic. Filmed with shaky handheld camera work, the footage captured the undeniable grim reality of incarceration. The backdrop consisted of cinder-block walls, heavy metal doors, and standard-issue institutional bunk beds. Yet, against this austere environment, Meanley presented a jarring juxtaposition. Dressed casually in his cell, he appeared entirely unburdened by the weight of the life he had taken or the decades of confinement stretching out before him. He grinned into the lens, making aggressive gun gestures with his hands, pantomiming the very act of pulling a trigger that had left 20-year-old Lewis Williams dead in the street. Meanley utilized Instagram and other social media platforms to distribute these illicit recordings, pushing his taunts directly into the public domain. The content of these uploads was highly specific, clinical, and steeped in a profound lack of empathy. In one widely circulated image, Meanley posed in his cell, flashing a defiant smile. Superimposed over the photograph was a caption that read, "Away for life, 'cause I took his life," punctuated by a cartoon gun emoji. It was a direct, unambiguous boast regarding the murder of Williams. Another twisted post explicitly glorified the regional gang violence that had plagued South Yorkshire, referencing the criminal exploits of his associates with the caption, "We put Donnie on the map, 3 murders, let go." The abbreviation Donnie served as a shorthand for Doncaster, twisting the tragic loss of life into a sick point of civic pride for his gang faction. The most disturbing elements of Meanley's digital output were his raw freestyle rap videos, which surfaced predominantly between February and November of the years following his incarceration. These tracks were not abstract expressions of street life. They were thinly veiled, highly detailed recounts of the January drive-by shooting. In a 45-second video clip that rapidly went viral, Meanly delivered a fast-paced, unfiltered performance that detailed his lethal obsession with firearms. He rapped, "From young I have been silly, always kept my hands on it, always loved my shotties and my handguns." The use of the slang term shotties was a direct reference to the homemade slam gun he had discharged from the passenger seat of the stolen Jaguar. He did not shy away from describing the visceral reality of the murder. As the beat played faintly from another smuggled device in his cell, Meanly continued, "Video shoots on the daily, no streaming. 2 smoky barrels, and I am squeezing. Got 17, and he is screaming. Caught him with a shot, tried to run, left him leaking." The lyrics functioned as a grotesque confession broadcast to the world. He was gloating about the catastrophic neck and chest injuries Williams sustained, mocking the victim's final, desperate moments as he tried to flee the gunfire before bleeding to death on the pavement. The precision of the taunts demonstrated a chilling psychological detachment. During his trial, Meanly had casually suggested that his morbid fascination with shootings was probably the result of playing violent video games like Call of Duty. In his prison freestyles, he proved that he viewed the actual taking of a human life through the same detached, gamified lens. Meanly also used his lyrics to mock the justice system itself. Acknowledging his lengthy sentence, he rapped, "20 years left, I am not soon home. Say it with my chest, I have run up 20 on a blue phone." The blue phone reference highlighted his continued engagement in illicit prison networks. While bragging about operating contraband communications right under the noses of the wardens, he presented his sentence not as a punishment, but as an occupational hazard of the gangster lifestyle, a badge of honor to be paraded before his followers. The digital spread of these videos was rapid and extensive. Meanly's Instagram profile amassed over 10,000 followers. When hip-hop aggregation accounts on platforms like X reposted the freestyles, the clips racked up hundreds of thousands of views. The comment sections beneath these videos became a battleground, reflecting a deeply fractured societal response. A significant segment of drill music fans praised Meanly's flow and delivery, completely divorcing the artistic performance from the real-world bloodshed that inspired it. They left comments celebrating his authenticity, effectively validating his decision to leverage a murder for social media clout. Conversely, the broader public reacted with intense outrage. Viewers sharply criticized the ethics of platforms allowing a convicted murderer to broadcast violent boasts. Citizens and advocates questioned the efficacy of the penal system, demanding to know how a high-security facility could operate like a holiday camp, where inmates were free to produce music videos and maintain lucrative social media presences. For the family of Lewis Williams, the existence of these videos inflicted an unimaginable psychological toll. They were forced to navigate a reality where their loved one's killer was not only visible, but was actively monetizing and celebrating the worst day of their lives for digital validation. Every view, every like, and every share of T-Shots' music was a fresh desecration of Williams's memory. The brazenness of Meanly's online campaign eventually forced the hand of the authorities. The Ministry of Justice and HM Prison Service launched internal investigations into the security breaches that allowed the videos to be produced. Dedicated intelligence teams within the prison network scrambled to locate and confiscate the illicit mobile phones hidden in his cell. Formal requests were issued to social media companies to scrub the offending profiles and remove the videos from their servers. While the original Instagram accounts were eventually suspended and the main videos taken down, the nature of the internet ensured that the footage had already been ripped, downloaded, and archived by thousands of users. The authorities were engaged in a digital game of whack-a-mole, struggling to suppress a narrative that had already escaped their control. The legacy of the Lewis Williams murder ultimately extends far beyond the fatal gunshot in Mexborough. The case stands as a stark and troubling case study in the modern intersection of gang violence, digital culture, and the limitations of the justice system. It highlights a terrifying cultural shift where the finality of murder is cheapened into content and where the perpetrators of violence are shielded from obscurity by the very technology the state struggles to regulate. Taylor meanly sought notoriety through the barrel of a slam gun, and despite the imposition of a 27-year minimum sentence, the viral echo of his prison rap videos ensured that his violent ambitions were tragically realized. His ability to reach beyond the prison walls to torment a grieving family serves as a grim reminder that in the digital age, locking a killer in a cell does not always silence their voice.